The first thing I saw when I walked into the High Mesa Preserve maintenance yard was my $45,000 John Deere, chained to a steel bollard like somebody had arrested it. A white sign hung from the loader in thick black letters. Property impounded. Community Safety Enforcement. And Trent Reddick stood beside it, rolling my tractor key between his fingers with the kind of smile people wear when they think the argument is already over. His wife, Camille, the HOA president, waited near the clubhouse door with a neat stack of papers pressed against her cream sweater, looking less like someone who had taken private property and more like a banker waiting for a signature. Then Trent held up my key. "You want your tractor back, Reed? Sign the access agreement." I looked past him at the chain, the sign, and the machine I used to maintain 82 acres of northern Colorado ranch land, then pulled out my phone and started taking pictures. That bothered him. I photographed the chain around the frame, the bollard, the impoundment sign, the hour meter, the serial plate, and finally Trent standing there with my key, because anger can disappear from memory, but a clean record tends to stick around. Camille stepped closer and told me they had conducted what she called a temporary safety impoundment after I refused to cooperate with the community's emergency access requirements. Interesting choice of words. "You entered my ranch and took it?" I asked. Camille's face tightened just a little, and Trent answered for her. "We removed a hazard under Community Safety Authority." I knew Halvorsen Ranch sat completely outside their HOA, and I knew I had never given Trent permission to touch that tractor, but arguing jurisdiction in a maintenance yard would have given them exactly what they wanted, a loud confrontation they could later describe any way they pleased. So I kept my hands in my jacket pockets. Camille handed me a 3-page document titled Emergency Access Compliance Agreement and tapped the signature line with one polished fingernail. She said the tractor could be released as soon as I acknowledged the HOA's existing access rights across my gravel road, the same private road my father had maintained for fire crews long before High Mesa Preserve existed. I read the first page once, then again more slowly, because one phrase jumped off the paper. Previously granted emergency ingress and egress rights. Previously granted. That was the first real crack in their story, because if those rights had already been legally granted, there was no obvious reason they needed my signature to confirm them now. And there was certainly no reason my tractor needed to be sitting behind their clubhouse wearing an impoundment sign. I folded the agreement carefully and tucked it under my arm. "I'll keep this for the file." Trent laughed. "What file?" I didn't answer him, because there are moments when explaining yourself only helps the other side fix its mistakes. Instead, I took one last photograph and walked toward my truck. Trent called after me. "You're leaving without your tractor?" I stopped at the gate and looked back. "Don't move it again." His smile returned. "Or what?" I held his gaze for a second. "Then I'll have 2 locations to document instead of 1. He didn't laugh that time. 36 hours earlier, I had been in Denver on a federal prisoner transport when my ranch cameras sent an alert to my phone, and the video showed Trent entering through my private gate, climbing onto the John Deere, starting it, and driving it toward High Mesa. Less than 20 minutes later, Camille emailed me a message with the subject line, "Temporary Safety Impoundment Completed," which was useful because she had just put the HOA's version of events in writing before I had asked a single question. I downloaded the original camera files, backed them up separately, saved her email, pulled my purchase paperwork and insurance records, and wrote down the tractor's serial number and the exact time shown on the footage. I was already building the record. What Camille and Trent did not know was that ranching wasn't my only job, and years of working as a deputy U.S. Marshal had taught me something simple. When somebody hands you evidence against themselves, don't interrupt them. But I also knew my badge did not give me special property rights, so I never mentioned it. When I called Larimer County Sheriff Dean Pritchard and reported the tractor as a property owner, I told him where the machine had been, where it was now, who had moved it, and that nobody had my permission to take it. Nothing more. I wanted a clean local record because if this turned ugly, I wanted the facts to stand on their own without anyone claiming I had thrown federal authority around to win a neighborhood dispute. That mattered. That evening, back at the ranch, I laid Camille's agreement beside my deed and plat map on the kitchen table while the November wind pushed against the windows. I kept coming back to that same phrase, previously granted, because people usually choose words like that for a reason, especially when millions of dollars in new development may depend on a road they do not own. The tractor was only what they had taken. The road was what they wanted. And if you've ever dealt with a property dispute where one strange sentence in a letter, deed, survey, or agreement changed the whole situation, that's the kind of field note worth sharing with the rest of us. Because somebody hearing your experience may remember to save the one piece of paper they would otherwise throw away. Halvorsen Ranch had been in my family long before anyone poured the first foundation at High Mesa Preserve, and the 82 acres sat where the open grassland started climbing toward the foothills north of Fort Collins. My father, Walter, raised me there in a plain cedar-sided house with a wide porch, a machine shed, 2 fenced pastures, and a gravel road that ran from the county road across our property toward the higher ground. To most people, that road looked like nothing more than crushed stone and tire tracks, but to Dad it had a second purpose every summer when the grass turned dry and wildfire season settled over northern Colorado. He kept that road open for a reason. Walter was a volunteer firefighter for more years than I can remember, and when I was a kid, I would ride beside him while he cleared fallen branches, trimmed weeds along the shoulders, and checked the narrow places where a fire engine might have trouble getting through. He never had much patience for speeches about community service, but he would spend an entire Saturday fixing a washed-out section of road because he knew 5 minutes could matter when smoke was coming over a ridge. You do not wait for a fire to fix the road, he used to tell me. You fix it before anybody needs it. Simple rule. What Dad also understood was the difference between helping your neighbors and giving away control of your land, which was why he allowed legitimate fire and rescue crews through when needed, but never treated our road as a public street. There was no neighborhood traffic crossing the ranch, no subdivision gate at the far end, and no standing invitation for contractors to use it because another route was inconvenient. When someone needed access for a real emergency, Dad opened the gate, and when the emergency was over, the gate belonged to the ranch again. That line mattered. After Dad died, I came back to manage the place myself, and I bought the John Deere because 82 acres can turn into a full-time argument with nature if you stop maintaining them. It cut hay, moved material, cleared snow, handled pasture work, and helped me keep Dad's old fire lane wide enough that county equipment could still get through if the foothills ever lit up. $45,000 was real money, but I bought the machine as working equipment for a valuable property, not as some shiny toy to park where neighbors could admire it. I took care of it. The ranch was not neglected, either, and neither was I some broke old cowboy hanging on to a forgotten patch of dirt, which seemed to be the picture Camille and Trent had created in their heads. I wore clean dark jeans, a slate-colored work shirt, good leather boots, and a wax jacket when the weather turned, because there is no rule saying owning cattle means dressing like you lost a fight with the barn. I kept the fences maintained, the taxes current, the equipment insured, and the property records organized. Details matter. My federal work took me away from the ranch at times, so I had cameras at the gate and around the equipment area, remote alerts on my phone, and backups for anything important. That was not paranoia. It was the same habit that made me keep purchase receipts, maintenance records, certified mail slips, plats, tax statements, and copies of the deed where I could find them quickly. Years of casework had taught me that 6 months after a dispute starts, 2 honest people can remember the same conversation differently, but a dated receipt usually has a much better memory. Paper does not get embarrassed. For a while, none of that seemed especially important because High Mesa Preserve was simply the new development beyond our boundary. 72 expensive homes arranged along curving streets with mountain-style stone entrances and landscaping that looked greener than anything around it had a natural right to be. Construction had been impossible to miss, of course, but it stayed on the other side of the recorded line, with marked utilities, survey stakes, trucks entering from the subdivision side, and the normal noise that comes with building houses. I did not like every change, but people have the right to build on land they actually own. So did I. The first sign that High Mesa wanted more than peaceful coexistence arrived in a heavy envelope from the Homeowners Association, addressed to me as an adjacent property stakeholder. Inside was a polite letter about dust control, livestock noise, visual harmony, and the visibility of agricultural equipment from several High Mesa lots, followed by language suggesting neighboring owners had a duty to support the community's safety standards. I read it twice because Halvorsen Ranch was not part of their association, had never signed their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, and had existed long before their first house. Then I saw Camille Reddick's signature. That was when the boundary problem really began. Camille Reddick did not look like someone who planned to spend her retirement arguing about trash cans and lawn colors, and that was exactly why I paid attention to her. She was 54, with a sharp auburn bob, a camel wool coat she wore whenever she wanted to look official, and the calm voice of someone who had spent years in risk consulting learning how to make a demand sound like a favor. Within months of becoming president of High Mesa Preserve, she had created something called the Community Safety Committee and put her husband, Trent, at the center of it. Trent liked the title. The problem was that a committee title did not give either of them authority over my ranch, so I answered Camille's first letter with a certified response instead of an argument. I included a copy of my deed, the recorded plat showing the High Mesa boundary, and a short statement explaining that Halvorsen Ranch was outside the association and was not subject to its covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I also asked her to identify any recorded easement or county document that gave High Mesa rights across my property. Then I kept the receipt. Camille answered 6 days later, and her letter never addressed the question I had actually asked. Instead, she wrote that adjacent properties were expected to follow reasonable mitigation expectations involving dust, noise, equipment visibility, and emergency planning, as if putting 3 official-sounding words together could move a property line. There was no statute number, no recorded easement, and no legal description attached. I marked all 3 missing items. That was about the time I started hearing more about High Mesa's planned second phase, 46 additional homes that would extend the development toward the western side of my ranch. The first phase already had 72 homes, and the developer had been advertising the expansion with mountain views, walking trails, and what their sales material called improved emergency circulation. I did not care about their sales pitch until I noticed that Camille's letters had slowly stopped talking about my tractor being ugly and started talking more often about emergency access. The subject had changed. One Tuesday afternoon, Camille came to the ranch herself, stopping outside my gate in a dark gray sport utility vehicle while I was checking a fence line near the road. She stayed on the public side, which I appreciated, and told me High Mesa wanted to formalize cooperation between neighboring properties before the next development review. If you are asking to use my road, I said, send me the recorded right you think you already have. Camille gave me a thin smile. Read, nobody is trying to take anything from you. I nodded toward the folder in her hand. Good. Then this should be easy. She left without giving me a document. 3 mornings later, Trent did not stay outside the gate. My camera alert went off while I was in the equipment shed, and when I walked toward the gravel road, I found him about 200 yards inside my property with a contractor wearing a reflective vest. The contractor had a measuring wheel, Trent had a clipboard, and small orange flags had appeared along the shoulder of the road my father had maintained for decades. They were measuring something. Morning, I said as I approached them. Trent looked up like I had interrupted work on property he owned. We are checking setback and drainage for emergency access. I stopped several feet away and kept my voice even. Who gave you permission to do that on my ranch? He sighed, opened the clipboard, and pulled out a color map with the High Mesa logo in one corner. A thick line ran from Phase 2 toward my gravel road, and printed beside it were the words Secondary Emergency Access. There it was. I asked if I could see the map more closely, and while Trent explained that the route had been part of High Mesa's planning for years, I took out my phone and photographed the page before he folded it away. The contractor suddenly became very interested in his measuring wheel. Smart man. I told them the visit was over, then followed up that afternoon with written notice to Camille, the board, and the association's management address stating that no one from High Mesa had permission to enter Halvorsen Ranch for inspections, surveys, construction planning, or routine access. I also made one point especially clear. Allowing county fire and rescue onto private property during a real emergency was not the same thing as granting a subdivision permanent access. Camille never answered that point directly. Instead, another envelope arrived the following week labeled Notice of Hazardous Agricultural Equipment, claiming my John Deere created a visual obstruction and emergency mobility hazard near the proposed evacuation corridor. That was when the whole thing stopped looking like ordinary homeowners association overreach. A tractor sitting on land they did not control had somehow become a hazard to a road they did not own, leading to an expansion they had never asked me to approve. Somebody needed that road badly. The hazardous equipment notice gave me 72 hours to remove my tractor from what Camille called the proposed emergency mobility corridor, which was a strange demand because the John Deere was parked beside my equipment shed, more than 100 feet inside my recorded property line. I answered in writing the same afternoon and asked for 3 simple things: the legal authority behind the notice, the recorded document creating their claimed corridor, and the rule allowing High Mesa to enforce anything on land outside its association. I sent the response by certified mail, saved a digital copy, and added the delivery receipt to the folder that was getting thicker by the week. They answered none of it. Instead, 2 days later, Camille sent a short email saying the board had reviewed my objection and considered the safety matter unresolved, while Trent left a voicemail telling me I was making a simple problem harder than it needed to be. I saved the voicemail, exported the email as a separate file, and wrote down the date and time because I had learned long ago that small details become important when people start changing their stories. I did not call Trent back. That Friday morning I had to drive to Denver for a federal prisoner transport, so before leaving the ranch I checked the gate camera, the equipment camera, and the remote alerts on my phone. The tractor was parked where it always sat when I was not using it, the key was stored where it belonged, and there was no scheduled work that gave anyone from High Mesa a reason to enter my property. By late morning, I was busy with my assignment and had almost forgotten about the HOA. Then my phone vibrated. I could not deal with the alert immediately, but when I had a safe break, I opened the camera application and saw Trent's truck near my gate. The next clip showed him inside the ranch, walking toward the equipment area, and another showed him climbing onto my John Deere before driving it down the gravel road toward High Mesa. I watched the clips twice. Then I stopped. My first instinct was the same one any property owner would have had. Call him immediately and tell him to bring the machine back. But that would have warned him before I knew what story the HOA planned to tell about what he had just done. The tractor was insured, the cameras were recording, and nobody was in immediate danger. So the lower risk move was to preserve the evidence and let them explain themselves first. That choice paid off 20 minutes later. Camille sent an email with the subject line, "Temporary Safety Impoundment Completed," stating that the hazardous agricultural equipment had been relocated pending my execution of an emergency access compliance agreement. I stared at that sentence for several seconds because she had done something I could never have forced her to do in a telephone argument. She put it in writing. By the time I returned to the ranch, I had already downloaded the original camera clips, copied them to separate storage, saved Camille's message with its full timestamp, and pulled the John Deere purchase and insurance records from my files. I also photographed the empty place beside the equipment shed where the tractor had been parked and checked the gate area for anything that might show how Trent entered. Nothing dramatic, just documentation. The next morning I drove to High Mesa instead of trying to recover the machine myself, because cutting a chain or driving the tractor out of their yard could have handed Camille a completely new argument about damage, confrontation, or unauthorized entry onto association property. I wanted their conduct cleanly separated from mine, so I parked legally and walked in. That was when I found the John Deere chained to the steel bollard, the impoundment sign hanging from the loader, and Trent holding my key while Camille waited with the agreement that I had later carried home. The scene made more sense now, but not in the way they intended. The tractor was leverage. Back at my kitchen table that evening, I compared Camille's agreement with my deed, the recorded plat, and the photograph I had taken of Trent's High Mesa concept map. Their map showed my gravel road feeding directly into the planned second phase, while my recorded plat showed the ranch boundary exactly where it had always been. More important, the agreement did not ask me to grant a new easement in clear language. It asked me to acknowledge previously granted emergency ingress and egress rights. That wording bothered me enough to make one more decision before bed. I would not accuse Camille of lying, and I would not tell her what I suspected. Not yet. The next morning I contacted the county planning office and asked for the public records connected to High Mesa Phase 2, including emergency access documents, submitted maps, and anything referencing Halvorsen Ranch. I also asked for certified copies where available because a screenshot from a website can start an argument, while a certified government record usually ends one. The clerk told me the request might take a little time to assemble. I told her that was fine. While I waited, Camille sent another message saying storage and enforcement costs could begin accruing if I continued refusing to cooperate, and Trent sent a shorter one saying, "Sign it and get your tractor back." I saved both. Every message was making the same mistake clearer. They were treating possession of my machine as pressure for my signature on a road agreement. Then the county called. A planning staff member named Marshal Vega said she had found the file I was asking about. But before sending the copies, she wanted to make sure she had the correct Walter Halvorsen connected to the property. "Walter was my father," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Halvorsen, I think you should come see this document in person." I looked at the photograph of Dad that still sat near the kitchen window. "What document?" Marshal lowered her voice even though there was nobody else in my kitchen. "An emergency access consent. It says Walter Halvorsen signed it." My hand stopped over the folder. Dad had never mentioned one. I drove to the county planning office. The next morning with Dad's probate papers in a folder on the passenger seat and Camille's agreement tucked beside them. Marshal Vega met me at the records counter, a practical woman in her 40s who spoke carefully and never acted like a government file was more important than the person standing in front of her. She turned her monitor toward me, opened the High Mesa Phase 2 folder, and said, "I wanted you to see the date before I said anything else." Then she pointed. The document was titled Emergency Access Consent, and it claimed Walter Halvorsen had approved emergency ingress and egress across the gravel road on our ranch for future development east of the property. Dad's name appeared at the bottom above what looked like a signature, followed by a notary section and a parcel reference that meant nothing to me yet. I read the date once, checked it against the probate record I had brought, and read it again. 11 months after Dad died. I did not accuse anyone of forging anything because I had spent enough years around investigations to know the difference between seeing something suspicious and proving how it got there. Instead, I asked Marshal where the document came from, when the county received it, and whether it had been treated as a recorded easement or simply submitted as part of the development review package. She pulled up the filing history and explained that High Mesa Phase 2 still had an unresolved emergency access issue, which was why the document mattered to the developer. Now I understood the pressure. Phase 2 called for 46 additional homes, and the county's review required an acceptable secondary route for emergency access before the project could move through its final approval steps. The proposed route shown in the developer material connected directly to the gravel road across Halvorsen Ranch, the same road Camille kept calling an existing emergency corridor. Without a valid right to use it, their plan had a hole in it. A big one. I asked Marshal for certified copies of the consent, the submitted maps, the planning correspondence that referenced my property, and the current status of the emergency access review. She nodded, then warned me that planning files could show what someone submitted but did not automatically prove that a private property right actually existed. For that, she said, you need the recorder and the chain of title. That was useful advice. And it was exactly the kind of distinction people miss when an official-looking map lands in front of them. A plan is not a deed. Before leaving, I asked one more question. If the access already existed, why would they need me to sign another agreement? Marshal leaned back slightly and chose her words with care. That is something you should ask whoever drafted the agreement. I almost smiled. I already knew I was not going to ask them yet. On the drive home, Camille's wording finally made sense in a way I did not like. She was not asking me to create a new right across the ranch. She was asking me to acknowledge a right they claimed Dad had already granted. If I signed without understanding that language, they might later point to my signature and say Walter's heir had accepted the old arrangement. That made the tractor much more than a fight over equipment. It was pressure. That afternoon, I cleared the kitchen table and started building a timeline instead of relying on memory. I placed the deed and recorded plat first, then Dad's probate record and death information, followed by every certified letter from Camille, the photograph of Trent's concept map, the hazardous equipment notice, my written objections, the camera footage log, Camille's impoundment email, the tractor purchase record, and the agreement they wanted me to sign. At the end, I placed the supposed consent from Dad. The dates told a story. I created a simple evidence list showing what each item proved, where it came from, and whether I had an original, a certified copy, or only a working copy, because good records are not just about having paper. They are about knowing which paper can actually be verified. Then I contacted the county recorder's office to request the full chain of title and every recorded easement affecting the ranch. I also made a note to have the property maps reviewed by a licensed surveyor rather than trying to interpret every line myself. No shortcuts. Camille apparently believed time was on her side, because that evening she sent another email warning that continued non-compliance could lead to nuisance action, monetary penalties, and what she called annexation enforcement. I read the message twice, saved the original, and searched the attachments for any legal document showing High Mesa had actually annexed my property into anything. There was none. The next message was more revealing. Camille wrote that the board expected my acknowledgement before the November 14th compliance review, and that continued refusal could affect the release of my equipment. There it was in plain English: signature first, tractor second. I checked the calendar and realized November 14th was less than 3 weeks away, which meant their pressure was tied to a deadline rather than some sudden concern about where I parked farm equipment. I replied with one sentence: I will be there. Then I closed the laptop and looked again at Dad's supposed signature. Walter Halvorsen had spent his life keeping that road open when firefighters truly needed it, and I could still hear him telling me that helping somebody did not mean handing them the keys forever. Someone had taken that good faith and turned it into a claim over our land. Now I needed to find out who. The county recorder's office was my next stop, because planning files could show what High Mesa wanted to do, but the recorded land records would show what anyone actually had the legal right to do. Heather Salazar met me at a counter covered with parcel maps and document folders, and I handed her the ranch information without telling her what conclusion I expected. I wanted her search to stand on its own, not become an answer shaped by my suspicion. Facts first. Heather worked backward through the chain of title, checking deeds, recorded easements, releases, and other documents tied to the Halvorsen parcel. Walter's ownership was there, the transfer through probate was there, and my current title was there, but nothing she found granted High Mesa Preserve or its developer a permanent access right across our gravel road. She checked again under older parcel references and neighboring property records in case the document had been indexed somewhere unexpected. Nothing. I am not seeing a recorded easement for them, Heather said, turning the monitor toward me. That does not tell us what somebody may have submitted to planning, but I do not see one recorded against your chain of title. I nodded and asked for certified copies of the relevant records. That distinction mattered. An association could print a beautiful map, put a colored line across somebody else's property, and call it an emergency corridor, but the colored line itself did not create a property right. A planning concept was not the same thing as a recorded easement, and a committee vote was not the same thing as permission from the owner. Paper had rules. Then Heather examined the emergency access consent that Marisol had shown me, and her expression changed when she reached the notary section. She checked the commission information against county records, made another search, and finally pointed at the date. This commission was no longer active when this acknowledgement supposedly happened. That did not prove who created the document, and neither of us pretended it did, but it added another problem to a paper already carrying the signature of a man who had been dead for 11 months. Then she noticed the parcel number. The numbering format printed on the consent had not been used for our property during Dad's lifetime. So Heather pulled the county conversion history and showed me when that system had been adopted. It came later. A dead man had apparently signed a document using a parcel format from the future. I did not need to make that sound dramatic because it already was. I asked Heather to certify what her office could certify and avoided asking her to label the document fraudulent, since that conclusion belonged to investigators and, if necessary, a court. From there, I called Evan Bellamy, a licensed surveyor who had worked on rural parcels around the foothills for years, and gave him the recorded plat plus the High Mesa map I had photographed when Trent was standing on my land. I told him exactly what I needed, compare the boundaries, and tell me whether I was reading them correctly. 2 days later, he called me into his office. Evan placed the recorded survey and the High Mesa concept map on his screen, aligned known reference points, and showed me that the subdivision drawing had shifted the apparent boundary by roughly 18 feet near the gravel road. 18 feet did not sound like much until you saw what it accomplished. On the High Mesa map, that shift made my private road appear to line up neatly with their proposed emergency corridor, while the recorded survey put the road where it belonged, inside Halvorsen Ranch. Evan prepared a signed professional overlay showing the difference. Another piece clicked into place. By then, Sheriff Dean Pritchard had the tractor camera footage, Camille's impoundment email, my ownership records, the photographs from the maintenance yard, and the agreement tying release of the machine to my signature. I told him about the questionable consent, but did not ask him to treat my federal position as a reason to move faster. Dean, handle me like anybody else who walked in with this evidence. He gave me a long look and said, "That is exactly what I intend to do." Good. My badge could identify my job, but it could not turn weak evidence into strong evidence, and I wanted every step of this case to survive without it. That was the lesson Camille still had not learned. Authority has boundaries, whether the authority belongs to an association president or a federal officer. I went home and added the certified title records, notary information, parcel history, and Evans survey overlay to my evidence list. For separate questions now had 4 separate answers. High Mesa had no recorded easement in my chain of title. Dad could not have signed the consent on the date shown. The notary information did not match an active commission at that time, and the HOA concept map did not match the recorded boundary. The pattern was getting harder to explain away, but I still did not know who benefited enough to take this kind of risk, so I went back through the Phase 2 planning correspondence Marshal had provided and started reading the boring pages most people skip. Meeting dates, review notes, fire access comments, developer responses, scheduling updates. That was where the money started showing itself. Phase 2 had 46 planned homes, 31 already under contract, and a November 14th compliance review tied directly to the unresolved second emergency exit. Every week of delay meant more carrying costs for the developer and more pressure from buyers waiting on homes they expected to occupy. Then I found Camille's name in older advisory committee material. Trent's appeared in Phase 1 construction records. I sat back from the table. They were not fighting over my tractor. They were fighting a deadline. Once I knew the deadline mattered, I stopped reading the High Mesa records like a landowner defending a road and started reading them the way I would read a case file. The 46 homes in Phase 2 were not just boxes on a planning map, because 31 families had already signed contracts and the developer was carrying land, construction, financing, and scheduling costs while those homes waited for final approval. County Fire Review kept returning to the same unresolved problem. The expansion needed an acceptable second emergency exit, and the easiest route on their drawings crossed Halvorson Ranch. That was the pressure point. I went back through meeting minutes, planning emails, contractor notes, and older development records, matching names and dates against the timeline spread across my kitchen table. Camille had served on a developer advisory committee during the planning period, which explained why an HOA president knew so much about a project that technically belonged to a separate development company. Trent's connection was even clearer. He had worked as a site superintendent during Phase 1, and later records showed that he remained involved as a consultant on work connected to the expansion. They had skin in the game. The paperwork did not tell me every dollar either of them expected to make, and I was not going to invent a number just because it made the story sound better. What it did show was a business relationship, a stalled project, 31 contracted homes, and a deadline. That became more expensive every week. The access problem remained unsolved. Camille's reputation as the woman who could keep High Mesa moving was tied to it, while Trent's consulting work depended on construction moving forward. Money and status were pointing the same direction. Then I found the sentence that tied everything together. It appeared in the minutes from a closed board session under a discussion of Phase 2 access coordination. Obtain Halvorson acknowledgement before November 14th compliance review. I read it 3 times, then placed it beside the agreement Camille had tried to make me sign. Same word. Acknowledgement. They were not asking me to sell them an easement, negotiate one, or grant a new right in exchange for fair terms, because doing that would admit they did not already have access. Instead, they needed me to acknowledge the old consent carrying Dad's impossible signature, and my signature could give them something they did not have now. A living property owner apparently accepting their version of the past. That changed everything. The tractor had been taken only after I refused to recognize the corridor, and Camille's own email connected its release to the agreement. Trent's voicemail was even simpler. Read, this has gone far enough. Sign the paper, get your tractor back, and everybody moves on. I saved the original recording. Everybody except me. At that point, I could have called Camille, told her what Heather had found, told Trent that Evan's survey showed the 18-foot boundary problem, and warned them that Dad had been dead 11 months when their consent was supposedly signed. That might have felt good for 5 minutes, but it would also have told them exactly which holes needed explaining before November 14th. I chose silence instead. Not passive silence. Working silence. I made copies of the evidence, preserved the originals, provided the relevant material through the proper local investigative channels, and kept a written timeline showing when each document had been received and from whom. I also made sure the people reviewing the matter understood that the homeowners buying Phase 2 houses were not my targets, because those families had relied on representations made by other people. I did not want innocent buyers paying for someone else's paperwork. That mattered to me more than embarrassing Camille. A few days before the meeting, another email arrived from her warning that the board could pursue nuisance penalties and annexation enforcement if I continued refusing to cooperate. I replied with one question asking for the recorded or statutory basis that gave High Mesa annexation authority over Halvorson Ranch. She never provided one. I saved that too. Sheriff Dean Pritchard called later that afternoon and asked whether I still planned to attend the November 14th meeting. Yes, I said. Are you planning to tell them what you found? Not before they tell the room what they think they have. Dean was quiet for a second. Understood. I knew better than to direct his investigation, so we kept our roles clean. I was the complainant and property owner, while his office and the appropriate county personnel decided what action the evidence supported. My federal position stayed out of it. 2 nights before the meeting, I reduced the mountain of paperwork on my kitchen table to one thin folder, because dumping 100 pages in front of a room usually hides the truth instead of proving it. Dad's probate record went first, then the disputed consent, the certified chain of title, the notary information, the parcel history, Evan Bellamy's survey overlay, Camille's impoundment email, the tractor records, and the board language about obtaining my acknowledgement. Each document answered one question. Nothing extra. On the morning of November 14th, I dressed the same way I would for any serious meeting. Clean dark jeans, a slate shirt, leather boots, and my waxed field jacket against the Colorado cold. My credential wallet went into the inside pocket because I still had responsibilities that did not disappear just because I was attending an HOA meeting, but I had no intention of putting it on the table. The folder went under my arm. That was the thing I planned to use. When I pulled into High Mesa that evening, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I expected, with residents, Phase 2 buyers, developer representatives, and county staff walking toward the entrance. Through the front windows, I could already see Camille standing beside a projection screen, perfectly composed in her cream sweater and charcoal trousers. The first slide was waiting behind her. Halvorson Access Compliance. She thought November 14th was her deadline for me. She had it backward. The clubhouse was packed by the time Camille called the meeting to order, and I recognized homeowners, county planning staff, several Phase 2 buyers, and 2 people seated beside the developer's attorney. A small camera near the front wall showed that the meeting was being streamed, while Camille stood beside the screen in her cream sweater with the calm expression of someone who believed the room was already hers. Trent stayed near the side aisle with his arms folded, watching me take a seat with one thin folder on my lap. Then Camille started. She spent several minutes talking about evacuation planning, community safety, and the need for neighboring property owners to cooperate with responsible development, and every sentence made the dispute sound like one stubborn rancher was blocking a road that High Mesa had used for years. She showed the concept map with the colored emergency corridor crossing my property, then displayed the agreement I had refused to sign. Finally, she looked directly at me. Mr. Halvorson, we are prepared to release your equipment tonight if you acknowledge the existing access arrangement. There it was. I stood, carried my folder to the front table, and asked if I could clarify a few facts before anyone discussed my signature. Camille smiled toward the room. Of course. I started with the easiest question. Did the board authorize Trent to remove my tractor from Halvorson Ranch? Camille hesitated just long enough for people to notice, then said the board had authorized a temporary safety impoundment. I asked whether Trent had personally entered my ranch and driven the tractor to the High Mesa maintenance yard, and Trent answered from the aisle that he had acted under community safety authority. Then I asked whether High Mesa was still holding the tractor until I signed the agreement. Camille nodded. Yes, because your cooperation is necessary. Good. The live stream had just captured their own version without me supplying it for them. So I opened the folder and placed Dad's probate record on the table. Beside it, I laid the emergency access consent that High Mesa had submitted in support of its claimed corridor. "This document says my father granted your access," I said. "Correct," Camille answered quickly. "That is our understanding." I pointed to the signature date. "Walter Halvorsen died 11 months before this, says he signed it." Nobody spoke. Camille looked down at the page, then toward the developer's attorney, while Trent shifted his weight and said there had probably been an administrative error. I did not argue with him because the next document was already in my hand. I placed the certified chain of title beside the consent and explained that the county recorder's records showed no recorded easement granting High Mesa Preserve or its developer permanent access across Halvorsen Ranch. Then came the notary information showing that the commission listed on the consent was not active on the date shown, followed by the county parcel history showing that the numbering format printed on the document came into use after Dad had died. 3 records. Same problem. Camille tried to move the discussion back toward public safety, saying old rural property records often contained technical inconsistencies and that High Mesa had relied on professional planning materials. I told her that was exactly why I had not relied on my own opinion, then placed Evan Bellamy's signed survey overlay on the table. The recorded boundary and the High Mesa concept map did not match near my gravel road, and the concept map shifted the apparent line by about 18 feet, just enough to make my private road look like it connected naturally to their proposed corridor. A county planning employee leaned forward to examine the copy. The room changed. I pulled out the photograph from the day I found Trent and the contractor measuring inside my ranch, followed by my written notice telling High Mesa it had no permission to survey or enter the property. Then I showed Camille's hazardous equipment notice, the camera timestamps from the day Trent entered while I was in Denver, and her email sent less than 20 minutes later announcing that the temporary safety impoundment had been completed. I finished with the agreement itself. "This does not ask me to grant you a new easement," I said. "It asks me to acknowledge one you claim already existed." Camille's face had lost some of its color. I placed the closed session language beside it. "Obtain Halvorsen acknowledgement before November 14th compliance review." Now, even the people in the back could understand the sequence without knowing anything about property law. The road claim came first. I refused to acknowledge it. My tractor was taken, and its return was tied to my signature. Simple. Trent finally stepped away from the wall and shook his head. "This is ridiculous. You are a farmer trying to play lawyer." I looked at him for a moment because that sentence told me he still had not understood what was happening. Then I opened my jacket and took out the credential wallet I had never shown either of them. Deputy United States Marshal. Trent's smirk disappeared so fast that several people turned to look at him instead of me, but I did not hold the credential up like a trophy or pretend it gave me authority over a county land dispute. I set it down beside the folder. "My badge is not why you are in trouble," I said. "This is..." I tapped the records. The developer's attorney immediately asked for a recess, while one of the Phase 2 buyers wanted to know whether the emergency route shown in her purchase materials actually existed. Camille tried once more to call the matter an internal homeowners association issue, but a county representative at the table answered before I could. "Recorded property rights are not created by an association presentation." That landed harder than anything I could have said. At the rear of the room, Sheriff Dean Pritchard stood with county personnel who had been reviewing the evidence through their own process, and for the first time Camille seemed to understand why I had never threatened her, never tried to take the tractor back myself, and never argued with Trent at the gate. I had not been waiting for my badge to rescue me. I had been waiting for their own records to finish telling the truth. The meeting did not end with Camille being dragged away or Trent suddenly confessing to everything, because real disputes usually move slower than that. What changed that night was simpler and more important. The story High Mesa had been telling about my road could no longer survive the records sitting on that table. The county had questions, the developer had questions, and the families waiting on Phase 2 homes had plenty of questions of their own. The paperwork had caught up with them. Over the next several weeks, Sheriff Dean Pritchard's office continued handling the tractor and trespass matter through normal local channels, while county officials reviewed the questionable access filing and the records connected to it. Trent faced consequences for entering my property and removing the John Deere without my permission, and Camille soon faced a different kind of judgment when High Mesa homeowners organized a recall vote over how the board had handled the entire affair. I stayed out of their internal politics because I had never wanted control of their association. I wanted control of my land. Camille lost the presidency, and the new board dissolved the Community Safety Committee that had given Trent his imaginary enforcement role. They also adopted a rule making it clear that volunteers could not conduct inspections, seizures, surveys, or enforcement activities on property outside High Mesa. Phase 2 remained on hold while the developer worked with the county to find a lawful second emergency route, and eventually that meant negotiating access with another property owner who was actually willing to discuss terms. That is how it should have happened from the beginning. My John Deere came home after the evidence surrounding its removal had been documented, and I inspected it before putting it back to work. I checked the hour meter, tires, loader, hydraulic system, ignition, and body, then documented the damage and costs instead of guessing at a number. The verified damage was handled through the proper process. Case closed on the tractor. But there was still one thing bothering me, and it had nothing to do with Camille or Trent. Dad had kept that gravel lane clear for years because he believed firefighters should never lose precious time to a fallen branch, deep snow, or an overgrown shoulder when somebody needed help. I did not want High Mesa's behavior to turn me into the kind of landowner who heard the word emergency and automatically answered no. So I contacted County Fire and Rescue myself. We worked through a narrow emergency-only access agreement that protected the ranch while allowing authorized fire and rescue vehicles to use the lane when a real emergency required it. The agreement did not belong to High Mesa, and it did not give the developer a daily shortcut or create a neighborhood road. The gate remained mine. One cold morning after the first heavy snow, I climbed into the John Deere and started clearing the fire lane just like Dad used to do. Snow rolled away from the blade in clean banks. The foothills were white beyond the pasture, and when I reached the gate, I stopped beside a new sign I had installed after everything settled down. It read, "Private Road, Emergency Access by County Agreement Only." I sat there for a moment with the tractor idling and thought about how close the whole mess had come to becoming something much bigger simply because somebody expected an official-looking document and an official-sounding title to scare me into signing. That was the real lesson. Looking back, I think stories like this work best as dramatized reminders of something very ordinary people deal with every day. Paperwork matters, evidence matters, and property rights are strongest when you understand them well enough to protect them without losing your head. A badge can change the temperature in a room, but it should never replace the deed, the survey, the receipt, the email, the camera record, or the lawful process that tells everyone where the lines really are. If somebody ever pressures you to sign away a right because they sound more official than you do, slow down, save what they sent. You, verify the records, and get the right professional help before you react. Documentation beats intimidation.